The Sunday school lessons for May 18th, 2025 are Worship is Restored and Mourning the Past or Celebrating the Future. Ezra chapter 3, verses 1 through 6 and verses 10 through 13. Welcome, viewers and subscribers, to my channel, Read With Me. If you are new here, please know that this is an audio reading of the lesson with intermittent commentary. Verse 1. When the seventh month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled together as one in Jerusalem. The story's setting in the seventh month places it in late September or early October. By this time, the Jews had two calendars, a civic calendar and a religious calendar. The reference here is to the seventh month of the religious calendar, the first month on the civic calendar. By name, the month was called Ethanim, before the exile, and Tishra, after the exile. By the time of the event described in the verse before us, those who had returned from exile had already dispersed to live in their ancestral villages. Apparently, few wanted to live in Jerusalem itself, leading to a situation where 1 in every 10 individuals was eventually selected by lot to inhabit the city. This seventh month of the Jewish religious year included 4 observances that would have drawn the people to Jerusalem. These were the blowing of trumpets on the first day, the Day of Atonement on the 10th day, the Festival of Tabernacles on days 15 through 21, and an assembly of the 8th day on day 22. But the reason the people assembled together as one to Jerusalem may not be any of these, as we shall see. The important leaders, Joshua, son of Zodadak, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, are mentioned together in a dozen Old Testament verses. These occurrences reveal that Joshua was the high priest and Zerubbabel was the governor. In these passages, we see Judah's religious leader and political leader working together to ensure the successful rebuilding of community and religious life. That rebuilding included the altar of the God of Israel in its traditional place in the temple courtyard, even though the temple remained in ruins. We may call their activity here leadership by example. The reconstruction of the altar was necessary, and it appears that the direct engagement of these two leaders played a key role in making it happen. When we read of the temple that Solomon built in Jerusalem, it suggests he funded and authorized the temple's construction rather than doing the physical work himself. However, considering the activities mentioned in the verse before us, the term build appears to have a more personal connotation. Even so, it wasn't just Joshua and Zerubbabel doing the work. The associates of each pitched in. The priests who had returned from exile were 4,289 in number, so there was no shortage of available labor. However, so many trying to work together to build the altar would result in people getting in each other's way. A more manageable number of priests helping the two leaders would be the 19 leaders of priests named in Nehemiah chapter 12, verses 1 through 7. The number of individuals associated with Zerubbabel who assisted in the task remains unknown. The function of the altar to sacrifice burnt offerings on it clarifies that this was the altar of burnt offerings, not the golden altar of incense, given how each had been used in both tabernacle and temple. These two altars are distinguished in the law of Moses in Exodus 27, verses 1 through 8, and others. The law of Moses gave specifications for the construction and function of the altar. Verse 2. Then Joshua, son of Zodadak, and his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his associates began to build the altar of the God of Israel to sacrifice burnt offerings on it. in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. The important leaders, Joshua son of Zozadak and Zerubbabel son of Shealtiel, are mentioned together in a dozen Old Testament verses. These occurrences reveal that Joshua was the high priest and Zerubbabel was the governor. In these passages, we see Judah's religious leader and political leader working together to ensure the successful rebuilding of community and religious life. That rebuilding of community and rebuilding life included the altar of the God of Israel in its traditional place in the temple courtyard, even though the temple remained in ruins. We may call their activity here leadership by example. The reconstruction of the altar was necessary, and it appears that the direct engagement of these two leaders played a key role in making it happen. When we read of the temple that Solomon built in Jerusalem, it suggests he funded and authorized the temple's construction rather than doing the physical work himself. However, considering the activities mentioned in the verse before us, the term build appears to have a more personal connotation. Even so, it wasn't just Joshua and Zerubbabel doing the work. Excuse me. The associates of each pitched in. The priests who had returned from exile were 4,289 in number, so there was no shortage of available labor. However, so many trying to work together to build the altar would result in people getting in each other's way. A more manageable number of priests helping the two leaders would be the 19 leaders of priests named in Nehemiah chapter 12, verses 1 through 7. The number of individuals associated with Zerubbabel who assisted in the task remains unknown. The function of the altar to sacrifice burnt offerings on it clarifies that this was the altar of burnt offerings, not the golden altar of incense, given how each had been used in both tabernacle and temple. These two altars are distinguished in the law of Moses in Exodus 27, verses 1 through 8, 30, verses 1 through 10, 37, verses 25 through 28, and 38, verses 1 through 7, 40, verses 5 through 6. The law of Moses gave specifications for the construction and function of the altar. Verse 3. Despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening sacrifices. The fact that the altar was constructed on the temple's foundation reveals reconstruction on the footprint of the one destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in 586 BC. The rebuilt altar thus became the fixed point around which the rest of the rebuilding work could proceed. The duration of time required to rebuild the altar is uncertain. Workers might have labored rather quickly because of their fear of the peoples around them. We read the actions of those enemies later. At this point, the nature of their threat is not evident. It may have been a threat of physical nature, designed to intimidate and demoralize the people, or the threat may have been perceived as spiritual, contact with unholy people making the altar, etc., impure. The text is not specific on this point. With the altar rebuilt, the priests reestablished the twice daily sacrifices on behalf of all the people as commanded in Exodus chapter 29, verses 38 through 46, and Numbers chapter 28, verses 1 through 8. It also permitted burnt offerings designed to inaugurate worship. Verses 4 through 5. Then, in accordance with what is written, they celebrated the festival of tabernacles with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each day. After that, they presented the regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, and the sacrifices for all the appointed sacred festivals of the Lord. as well as those brought as free will offerings to the Lord. Verse 4. The Festival of Tabernacles was one of the three annual pilgrimage festivals to Jerusalem. Exodus 23, verses 15 through 17, and chapter 37, verses 18 through 25, name these three festivals. At first reading of those passages, it may appear that there are more than three festivals, and that the Festival of Tabernacles is not among them. But there are indeed three, considering that 1. The two festivals of unleavened bread and Passover were often regarded as a singular observance, as they took place consecutively, and 2. The various festivals go by different names. Example, the Festival of Tabernacles is the same as the Festival of Ingathering. The phrase, what is written, witnesses the concern for rooting practice firmly in the law of Moses. Given the reality of and the reason for the Babylonian exile, it's understandable that this became very important during the post-exilic period. All this may lead us to conclude that the reason the people assembled together was one in Jerusalem was for this festival. But that little word then should cause us to not be too hasty in this conclusion. That word may indicate that a celebration of the Festival of Tabernacles wasn't the primary purpose of the gathering. Instead, the broader context of being able to resume burnt offerings could have been the main reason. For the nature of the burnt offerings prescribed for each day, see the reference to the twice daily sacrifices noted in chapter 3, verse 3 above. Chapter 5. This verse indicates the comprehensive reintroduction of the functions of the altar as established in Numbers 28 and 29. The sacrificial system was fully reinstituted from the earliest possible moment after the Judeans had reestablished themselves. The context of these offerings are summarized in terms 1. Those that are regular, 2. Those of the new moon, 3. All the appointed sacrifice festivals of the land, and 4. Those categorized as free will. Having already discussed the first of these, we now briefly examine the second. The ancient Jews used a lunar solar calendar, with the passage of months determined by the phases of the moon. A new moon, which is the opposite of a full moon, marked the first day of a new month. The burnt offerings prescribed for this day are outlined in Numbers chapter 28, verses 11 through 15. The third summarization includes a full array of festivals listed in the commentary on Ezra 3 to this point. Free will offerings, the fourth summarization of burnt offerings connected with vows. The carrying out of the sacrifices also required the reestablishment of animal husbandry and pasture management throughout the area around Jerusalem. This fact, in turn, implies a restoration of the basic mechanisms of ensuring that shepherds were paid, flocks protected, water sources managed, and so on. A return to something approaching the normal life had begun. Verse 6. On the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid. This verse supports the suggestion that the primary reason for the people to have assembled together as one in Jerusalem was not the Festival of Tabernacles, but the Festival of Trumpets. For the significance of the 7th month, see commentary on Ezra chapter 3, verse 1 above. The rebuilding of the altar allowed the Judeans to restart the prescribed worship of God. However, a gap remained in that the Lord's temple was absent. Its destruction in 586 BC had been complete. Even its foundation, originally laid in 966 BC, would need to be laid anew. Verse 10. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests, in their vestments and with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, took their places to praise the Lord as prescribed by David, king of Israel. The laying of the foundation of the temple of the Lord took about a year and a half. The identity of the builders and the source of at least some of the construction material is found in Ezra chapter 3, verses 7 through 9, which is not part of today's lesson. The vestments for the priests undoubtedly included the 100 priestly garments donated in Ezra chapter 2, verse 69. The trumpets mentioned here are not the kind made from a ram's horn. Instead, the word being translated for trumpets as used here is the same one that refers to those made from silver in Numbers chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. The prescriptions of David, king of Israel, for the organizations of musicians is found in 1 Chronicles chapter 6, verses 31 through 46. Levites, as temple musicians, are associated with various musical instruments in 2 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 25. By adhering to David's ordinance, the broader aim was not to discard the positive aspects of Judah's past, but to renew them. Verse 11. With praise and thanksgiving they sang to the Lord. He is good. His love toward Israel endures forever. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. Here we see another renewed connection with the past as the musicians sing of God's love and enduring goodness. These lyrics go back to King David centuries earlier. Verse 12. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. Verse 12. The temple had been destroyed in 586 BC, and the year was about 536 BC as the singing continued. Thus, it had been just about 50 years in between. Those who had been 20 years old when they witnessed the destruction of Solomon's magnificent temple had become older priests and Levites and family heads. The fact that they wept bitterly is quite understandable. They had to have been thinking of the sins of their generation that resulted in the destruction of that former temple. By contrast, those who shouted for joy were undoubtedly young enough to never to have seen Solomon's temple. The excitement of this accomplishment was to them unprecedented and thrilling. The computation of the 50-year interval mentioned above doesn't conflict with the prophecy of 70 years of oppression in Jeremiah chapter 25, verses 11 through 12, and 29, verse 10. The oppression of exiles occurred in the three waves of 605, 597, and 586 BC. Similarly, the return from exile occurred in three waves, 538, 458, and 444 BC. Thus, the computation of 70 years depends on selecting which starting and ending prompts apply. Now, I inadvertently omitted slide 13, but verse 13 reads, no one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping, because the people made so much noise and the sound was heard far away. As time progressed beyond this high emotion, it's easy to imagine excitement becoming disappointment and disillusionment. That's because the next 20 years turned out to be a tug of war between outsiders on whether or not the work on the temple should continue. Opposition to construction was eventually defeated. Still, the intervening years resulted in lethargy on the part of the Judeans. The Lord himself had to intervene to get the project back on track. The result was that the temple remained unfinished for two decades, not being completed until 516 BC. Thank you so much for listening. Join me soon for the next audio reading of the Sunday School lesson with intermittent commentary.